Hi, we're your hosts. I'm Himan Bekkele.
And I'm Haset Bekkele.
And you're listening to Hot Topics.
Five years ago from today, 3.2 billion people globally tuned in to watch an event.
After getting postponed, this event is finally taking place this summer.
So today, on an episode of Hot Topics, we talk about the Olympics.
Let's begin with the history of the Olympics.
Well, the idea of having competitive games dates all the way back to 776 BC. This was hosted by the ancient Romans.
This competition was completely different from the Olympic tournaments we know today. It only had one event, and instead of countries competing, individuals competed.
These games continued, adding new events each time. The first official Olympic game took place in 1896, though. This game was actually hosted by Greece.
In this Olympic game, there were about 240 athletes participating and 43 events.
The next Olympic game took place 4 years later, in 1900. This time, there were about 1,000 athletes and 95 events.
So every 4 years, the world's athletes would participate, adding more athletes and events every time.
Now let's fast forward to the 2016 Olympics that took place in Rio.
There were 306 events
and 11,234 athletes.
A huge improvement from 1896. The Olympics, as you may have noticed, take place every 4 years.
Last year was the first time the Olympics had been cancelled for a reason other than war.
The Olympics were cancelled in 1916, 1940, and 1944, all three cases due to the two world wars.
The 2020 Olympics were postponed because of the pandemic.
At that time, vaccines were not developed, and since we didn't know much about the virus, officials decided it would be beneficial to avoid all public gatherings. Certain countries had also begun removing their athletes.
Upon hearing these news, participating athletes had mixed feelings, but at the end of the day, they were grateful that safety and health was prioritized.
Speaking of athletes, we have all seen the talented athletes that compete in the Olympics, but you might be wondering, how are they chosen to compete for their nation?
Well, athletes are chosen to compete in the Olympics by the nation they are competing for.
Qualifying athletes can sign up to have the chance to compete in the Olympics.
Usually, countries hold Olympic trials to find their top athletes.
For example, the US held its trials a few weeks before the Olympics started.
During this duration of time, potential athletes showcased their skills to judges.
Later on, the US released a list of people they had accepted into their Olympics team.
Since the number of athletes countries are allowed to bring for each event is limited, countries cannot accept everyone who applies.
Smaller countries skip the trials and accept all qualifying applicants.
This year, the Olympics will introduce a few new events.
This includes baseball,
softball,
karate,
skateboarding,
sport climbing,
and surfing.
All these new events will definitely make this year's Olympic tournament a lot more special.
I definitely agree. But the new events are not the only reason this year's Olympic Games will be interesting. In the last few Olympics, children have been blazing through the trials, and that includes this year.
This includes Hen Zaza, Skye Brown, and Orion Knighton.
Let's start with Hen Zaza.
This 12-year-old Syrian girl is competing in table tennis.
Zaza competed in the West Asian Olympic Qualification Tournament and was accepted into the team.
Zaza is set to be the youngest athlete to compete at the Summer Olympics in Tokyo.
Next up, we have Skye Brown. You might have heard about this 13-year-old skateboarder.
Brown is competing in the Olympics for this year's Team UK.
She's actually competing in one of the new events, skateboarding.
Finally, we have Orion Knighton.
This 17-year-old sprinter is heading towards the Tokyo Olympics to become the youngest American man to compete on the Olympic track and field team since 1964.
Knighton is only 17, but he managed to beat Usain Bolt's world junior record.
This year's long-awaited Summer Olympics is taking place from July 23rd to August 8th, so be sure to tune in. Today on Informative, we talked about the 2021 Summer Olympics.
We walked through the history of the Summer Olympics.
We talked about how these talented athletes are chosen.
And we discussed what's special about this year.
We'd love to hear from you. Our contact information can be found in the description below.
Be sure to subscribe to be notified of our new episodes.
You can listen to the next episode of Hot Topics wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Heyman
and this is Hasset,
signing off.